So, Robert, thank you so much for taking some time today for Cinema World. That's cool.
Sure. Sure.
So, please, first of all, of course, tell me a little about your background. So, what was your first introduction, maybe, to film or let's say theater music? Let's start with that.
Well, my first introduction to theater music was when I was in the between the seventh and eighth grades. I was in a workshop where I was sort of one of many people who were in a sort of a summer workshop that did scenes from musicals and scenes from plays.
Mm-hmm.
And the most interesting thing to me was the guy who was playing the piano for the musical scenes. Um, and I found that far more exciting than being on stage.
Okay. So, did you play the
So
piano before?
I played the piano. At that point, I had been playing the piano for a few years.
Uh huh.
At that, I already had been doing some accompanying, in junior high school jazz band. I've been playing in that, and I've been playing some of the choir stuff. So I was familiar with the idea, but I wasn't really that familiar with musicals in terms of actually performing them. So that just got me sort of single-mindedly interested in musicals. And then when I got to high school, I started playing myself,
Mm-hmm.
and I also started really getting involved with the idea of arranging and composing. I did some composing and some arranging, and I just really enjoyed it. I actually remember very clearly, I'm dating myself, I guess, but I remember very clearly when the first Star Wars movie came out, summer of '77. And, and, and unlike I think a lot of people involved in film music, I didn't see that and say, I want to do that. I saw it and said, that's really great music and it's really a cool thing. But my focus was really on the theater, not, and movies were not really part of my consciousness, I guess.
So, what led you to become an orchestrator for films after that? Was it just a coincidence?
No, actually, it was a kind of a direct line because I worked when I finished graduate school. I was living in New York, and I started working with Elliot Goldenthal. And the first thing that I did with him was I was hired to help him prepare the score for a theater piece that he was writing with Julie
Oh,
Taymor.
there you go.
Yeah, and so I go way back with her too, and it was a piece called Juan Darien that was done. Uh, it was done off Broadway, and then it was revived at Lincoln Center about 10 years after that. And it was, a fantastic. It was a fantastic piece, really. It got a lot of attention. It really kind of put Julie on the map, I think. I remember it got an amazing review from New York Times, and the music was, of course, it was Elliot. It was fantastic, and he was very smart in that he decided he was just going to go into debt and make a recording of it and send it around. He did, and it got sent around, and it got into the hands of people who make movies, and they said, "We love this. We want him to score our movies."
Just like that, huh?
Just like that. I mean, I think that was back in the day when you could sort of do that. But he did get his CD in the hands of some film people, and they started hiring him. And the first film that we did together was Pet Cemetery, which was a pretty big first step. Really, it was a big Hollywood studio picture. Not it wasn't a huge budget, but it was a wide release. It was well known because of the Stephen King connection. And that got him a lot of attention, and eventually he got hired to do the score for Alien 3, like 2 years later, um, and and that's what really launched his and my career, I would say, in Hollywood. That's it for Alien 3. He had just hired out, or I should say, Fox hired for him a studio in L.A. called the Enterprise. Not sure if it's even there anymore. Um, and we all just, the whole team of us just were there for a week, I don't know, weeks.
Just moved in, huh?
We just moved in, and we all moved out to LA. And I mean, at that point we were all in New York. We all moved to LA for a few weeks, and knocked out the score together. So the shorthand became it became more less of a strict musical communication and more of a descriptive communication.
Okay.
As I think as I got used to the kinds of orchestral um, techniques that he loved and that he used so effectively, I kind of was able to sort of use them in the same way. And the other thing that about Elliot, which is great, is that he's classically trained. So we were able to do a lot of referencing. He would say, well, I want this to be a Mahler adagio, and that means certain things that Mahler did, certain ways of voicing the strings and whatnot and phrasing. And that kind of thing was also contributed a lot to the shorthand that we used.
Cool. I loved how Elliot talked about you when I met him, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago in Belgium, in Ghent. And
Oh yeah.
that was so funny because he was telling the story where I'm sure that happened a lot, but you guys were working in separate rooms, and he was looking for you. He couldn't find you, and you were there in your room with your feet on the table. You were calling your wife, and with the left hand you were doing orchestrations
Right.
separately, and the orchestration he said was perfect, and that's real talent. I was thinking you would actually do orchestrations as we speak simultaneously.
I could if you want. I actually have some I need to do here. No, that's exactly. I'm a big one. One of the things that I brought over from my theatrical background was the joy of collaboration. That theater is a bunch of people in a room putting something together.
Yes.
All at once. Whereas film is a bunch of people doing all their little separate jobs, and then it all gets brought together, during the dub. But nobody has any real sense of what anybody else is doing.
Yeah, right. Can you talk about the different ways of working with composers like Elliot or then Michael Kamen or Brian Tyler? Because I'm sure their approaches are all very different, right?
Well, in some ways they are. Michael's approach was not so very different. Just in so far as he was also somebody who sketched things out, and what he relied on. When he used to do all his own orchestrations for a long time until, I don't know, I think might have been the first Lethal Weapon movie, maybe, or maybe it was the first Die Hard, but it was one of his very first Hollywood movies, big studio movies, where he just did not have time to do it. And at that point, he just said, okay, let's gather a bunch of people together and help me orchestrate it. And what he used to do is he would sit down with you for half an hour, 45 minutes, go through the cue, bar by bar. He would play it and he would say, okay, hear that? That's the winds. And I know I didn't put it in the score here, but I'd really like the strings to be doing some kind of ostinato pattern here. And I mean, he would give we used to call them briefings. Yeah. He would give very detailed directions on what he wanted.
So he was very concerned about it, right?
Yes, he was very concerned about it. I think most composers who are also orchestrators are that way. They tend to be much more concerned with the details of orchestration than other composers who don't really think about it in terms of sort of symphonic orchestration. And so the other thing is about Michael is that he wrote so musically, at least to me. It really immediately suggested what he was going after. It's the example of somebody who would just draw a rough sketch of something, and a colorist would come along and just tell from the sketches would immediately suggest what colors to use and how to fill it out, and Michael was just brilliant at that. He was able to sketch things in a few bold strokes that made it, really sort of clear what he was after.
It must have been a privilege to work with that man, right? I mean,
Oh,
some of his scores. I mean, the one of the very first scores I actually bought, or my mom actually bought me after I saw the movie, was 101 Dalmatians.
Yeah.
Which was such a fun score. I mean, there were so many cues, so many moments where I was just like, that man must have just had a great time sitting at the piano and scribbling these things out. There was so much fun in that music.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun to do, that score. That was definitely one of the high points of my career with Michael. Yeah. I'm really glad to hear that. I like that score a lot. And one of the things about Michael was that he was one of the last sort of holdouts, along with Elliot actually, of mocking something up for the director so that it really sounded like what the orchestra was going to sound like. For Michael, all to the end, his idea was that the score is created at the scoring stage. You know, you play through it for a director, you describe what it's going to be, you sort of get him to sign on to your general idea, but then the scoring stage is where the score actually is heard for the first time. Fewer and fewer composers have that come from that sort of classic film score background.
Is it too harsh saying it's kind of dying? This kind of thing that you just described? Well,
I don't. Yeah, it's kind of dying. I mean, my take on it is that it was dying back in the 70s, late 60s and 70s. All those John Barry scores and or big I'm thinking of those big orchestral composers that were active in the 60s. Jerry Goldsmith was kind of just getting started, and it was all seemed very old fashioned. And of course, pop music was on the rise, and then you had a movie like The Graduate, which used the Simon and Garfunkel song so effectively, and everybody said, "Well, this is what we need. This is what film scoring should be."
Right.
Songs. And I have to give credit to John Williams, who, of course, I should add to that list of people who are still doing it the old-fashioned way. He single-handedly, practically, brought back classic Hollywood film scoring.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Agreed. So whenever I think of your and Elliot's music, of course I think of the highlights like Titus and all that, and my absolute favorite, which I see in the back there, Batman Forever, which is so over the top and just so, it's my absolute favorite because it's just like, it's so over the top. But what I love to think about when I think about the two of you is it's actually the same kind of music that I love to hear when Brian Tyler did it with you on Alien vs. Predator, which is just this kind of avant-garde-ish, loud, apeshit kind of stuff with experimental stuff in the strings, and the horns are doing the bending stuff and all that. Apart from me loving this kind of music and just loving every bit of it, do you like that kind of music as well? Because for a while, for me, it seemed like certain composers wanted you for their weird stuff.
Yes, you're right. In fact, that's how I got hooked up with James Newton Howard.
Outbreak?
Yeah, he had this idea. He referred to micropolyphony, which is a kind of thing that composers like Ligeti did, where he would have, for example, a string section, and every violin would play a different line, slightly different, so that it became a texture.
Right.
And he heard what I did in Alien 3, actually, and he thought, "Wow, this is just the sound I want for my movie."
Okay.
So that led to a fruitful, a really great collaboration until it sadly came to an end, which I've always been a little, sort of sad about.
That's too bad.
Yeah, he's another person who's a fantastic human being,
But do you think you got, because of this weird stuff we're talking about, do you think you got kind of pigeonholed because of that? Can you actually say that, or is it just?
Well, I don't know. It's hard for me to say whether there are some orchestrators who are pigeonholed, because I think in order to be a good arranger or orchestrator, you have to be familiar with so many different styles.
Exactly. That's why I actually don't like using that word. So.
Right. but I do think that early on I was associated with those kinds of um, those kinds of soundtracks. So, and I think Elliot was too, for that matter. I think I think when people think of his sort of signature sound, they think of movies like Alien 3. Even though he's done, again, huge amounts of completely different kinds of scores.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, how difficult is it for you to change gears between composers or even genres? Is it difficult for you if you work for different composers and you have to change gears?
I guess it's not. I mean, I guess I have an ability to compartmentalize to an extent, so that I can I mean, I have been in situations where I'm orchestrating for two composers at the same time,
Mm-hmm.
and I can, I'm usually able to, it's sort of like that story about me being on the phone while I was orchestrating. I can sort of do. It's not that I was multitasking so much as I was sort of just isolated from the rest of the world.
Right.
I mean, one thing I can do is I can orchestrate, for example, in a noisy situation.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool.
Because I can just, I just sort of block everything else out. Yeah. So I guess it's pretty easy for me to switch between projects from that point of view.
That's cool. So when working with more orchestrators on one project, which I think happens a lot nowadays. So
yeah.
Do you find it difficult to blend styles with other orchestrators who are working on the same score with you? Does that happen?
I would say that's a good question, actually. The most often I've done that is with Brian Tyler, because there's three of us that pretty much orchestrate everything he does, and I think the three of us by now, if we've been doing it for so long, I think that we're united by Brian's style. So it's not that the three of us, are orchestrating in our own style, and that we have to kind of blend our styles to match the other orchestrators. We blend our style to match the composer, and I think that's probably true of all orchestrators. Having said that, I have worked with some composers who have actually told me, I want you to take this and make this into something amazing. So they're sort of asking for me to bring my own creativity to it. And that's always great when that happens too. But I would say in general, and of course the composer is at the service of the movie. So really we're orchestrating for the movie. And the other thing is that mock-ups have become so prevalent that it's easy. It's very, very, well, not very, but much easier than it used to be to get a beat on what the composer is going for.
Was it easy for you to move into the sample world, or even the Finale Sibelius world, like leaving the handwritten stuff out? Because I'm not sure if you even get handwritten sketches anymore, or even write on paper anymore. Do you?
I have not gotten anything written out by hand. I don't know anybody. I mean, I guess John Williams is still doing that, but as long as there's enough detail in there for the orchestrator or the transcriber to sort of understand what needs to be on paper, it's sort of not as necessary for a composer to put anything down on paper.
So are you faster in Finale now that you may have been writing per hand?
Well, let me tell you something about that. I was actually a holdout.
I thought so.
I was familiar with Finale. I first encountered Finale back in the 80s when it was the only game in town, first of all, and also it was just breaking into the copyist world. Copyists were starting to adopt it, and I worked in New York for a copying office, so as a music copying place. So I ended up learning Finale there, and I found it incredibly helpful for some things and incredibly unhelpful for other things. like for example, if I for extracting parts, it's great
Uh-huh.
because you can take a score, and it's not only so much quicker to extract a set of parts from a score that's in the computer, but it's also much more accurate. But for me, I found, especially because I was doing so much work with Elliot that was non-traditional.
Yeah, sure, of course.
Yeah, and Elliot from his student days was very interested in non-traditional notation, graphic notation. So a lot of the stuff that we came up with just couldn't be done with Finale. And I just found that I was orchestrating according to what Finale could do, and not according to what I really wanted to see on the page. So I held out for a long time until it was really in the 2000s before I totally went over to scoring, to writing, putting everything into Finale.
And right now you can actually do pretty much everything in Finale that you want to?
I can. I'm capable enough with Finale that there's very few times when I have to give up on something because it's too hard. I have astounded myself sometimes at how quickly I can turn things around.
I was about to ask. I mean, a full page of orchestration, maybe 8 or 10 bars. How long would Robert Elhai need for this in Finale? I don't know.
But I mean, it totally depends. I've done it. I can do it in 2 minutes. If it's strings holding whole notes for 8 bars, I can do that in 2 minutes.
Sure.
If it's a really complicated, massive polyphonic kind of situation, then I have to, then it could take a lot more time. It could take as long as 2 hours even, or longer, to sort of suss through everything, figure out, well, if these guys are doing that, then these guys have to do that. And it also depends on how big the orchestra is, because it's also become quite common to only record part of the orchestra and to use samples. For example, for percussion, harp, and piano are often commonly sampled. And that cuts down on our time tremendously, because then we just have to figure out what the strings and brass and woodwinds are doing. If there's even woodwinds, which is, sometimes strings and brass.
Okay, so tell me about the projects that involve you as a composer, because I find it a little sad that people don't know about your skills and projects as a composer, because there's an interesting theater work that I recently heard about that you did. It's called C or C.
C, yeah.
It's just C. Okay.
It's called C period. Okay, well, C period is an adaptation of Cyrano de Bergerac.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason we called it that was because we make a big note. There's a point in the play where he talks about how he's going to write these letters for Christian, and all he needs to do is sign it with a C, because it will stand for Christian and also Cyrano. And just like that seemed like a great sort of summing up of some of what we were trying to do. So, well, that was a fantastic, that was a great project, and it was a very, very theatrical project, because it involved actors who also played. It involved this idea of music only coming from musicians who actually were playing characters. So that for example, we had Cyrano, instead of just being a poet, he was a poet and a singer, right? And in the first scene, which takes place in a theater, one of the things that happens is that he's talking to his friend about Roxanne, who he's obviously in love with, and he sort of, in the play, he kind of improvises these poetic lines, and we had this situation where there's a rehearsal going on in the next room, so you hear music coming from behind stage, and he's sort of, and Cyrano says something like, "Oh, that's a great tune, I love that song," and he just makes up lyrics to this. Well, it was original tune, of course, but for him it was something that he recognized, and he just made up lyrics to it as it floated through the air. And we had a lot of that. We used that conceit a lot in the musical, with the idea that there was never except for a few sort of very specially placed fantasy sequences, there was never a time when music just suddenly appeared out of nowhere and no one else could hear it. None of the characters could hear it, and so they sang as naturalistically as they spoke was the idea. And yeah, that was with a theater here in the Twin Cities called Theater Latida, which has done Latida, yeah, Latteda.
That's cool.
Latida. And and they've actually started a new program to encourage new musical theater. They have a program where they take 3 new musicals and workshop them for a couple of weeks and then do a public presentation. So so that's actually an organization really devoted to new musical theater. So I'm very happy about that. And it's funny, my composition really has. I mean, I've really maintained my connection with the theater by composing. Even though I've done a lot of orchestrating for the theater as well as for movies, and you can imagine I've had any number of opportunities to become a film composer per se, but I've never really wanted to go in that direction. I guess my heart has always been in the theater rather than in as much as I love working on movies and arranging for these big, huge orchestras and working with some of the most amazing musicians in the world. I guess from a origination point of view, maybe a creative point of view, I don't know. I really love the theater. Interesting, especially as film scores have become more and more sort of well known, and the film has become more and more well known. People go to the theater sort of with this idea that music will be used the way it is in a film, which is not always appropriate, but sometimes it's useful. So I tend to write a lot of musical scenes. I like to use underscoring a lot. I like to have the underscoring timed, just like it is in a film, where after somebody says something, the music changes. And that I think it's very effective in the theater as well.
So do you have any composing projects in your pipeline? Is there anything coming up?
Yes, there is actually. There is a project that I'm working on right now that it will be at the History Theater in St. Paul.
Uh-huh.
I've done three different projects for them now as an arranger. The latest one, called Lord Gordon is going to be produced this spring. And if you go to historytheater.org or something, it's a great show. And then in a year, they're going to produce a show that has my original music, which is called the as of unyet titled spy musical.
Okay.
It's about a woman. It's really about 3 women who spied for the Allies in World War II. And one of them especially was known as the female James Bond, because she had an amazing ability to hook up with various important people and get them to tell her secrets, sort of as pillow talk. She was a remarkable person. So that's what that musical is about, and that will be performed in the spring of 2019.
What are your favorite projects when it comes to composing for theater or movies, or orchestrating for theater or movies? What are some of your favorite projects? Maybe even some of your favorite cues. What stuck with you? What's some of the stuff that you can't forget anymore?
Well, there's 2 films I would say that really have stuck in my mind as 2 of the most sort of incredible projects that I got to work on, and just from a score point of view. Unfortunately, as movies, they weren't very successful, and they were both written by the same composer, Edward Schirmer.
Oh,
Who was a great friend of mine and also a great composer. He wrote the first movie I'm thinking of is called Rain of Fire, and the reason I love that film is because it was a very experimental orchestra, and I'm constantly trying to get composers to be more to sort of think about the idea of just basically most film music is composed for a symphony orchestra, sometimes with woodwinds and sometimes without, but always with violin one, violin two, viola, cello, bass, four horns, three trumpets, often more horns, 6 or 8 horns. But the idea, what I loved about one of the things I love about Bernard Herrmann and his idea that this is music that's meant to be recorded and not performed is that you could get a huge, bizarre ensemble into a scoring stage. You could fill it. You could get 12 harps, say, to a scoring stage and record them. Whereas if you were going to give a concert with 12 harps, it would be much more difficult logistically. And so I love the idea of orchestrating for kind of unusual instrumentations. And what we had for that, one of the things we were told from Rain of Fire is that the director didn't like violins. And of course, who knows what that means, really? But
I can imagine where this is going.
it's one of those things. So we already were thinking we were going to sort of limit the number of violins.
Uh-huh.
And I just love the idea that we actually had 12 violin. No, what did we have? 16 violins, 16 violas, 16 cellos, and 10 basses. And that was a string section. So it was very heavy on the lower strings. And it was just one section of violins. It wasn't a violin one, violin two. And the other great thing that we did is the woodwinds were 8 flutes encompassing the entire flute family, 8 clarinets also encompassing the entire clarinet family, and 4 bassoons. So we had, it was just this, and then on top of that, there was a big brass section and percussion, and it just was such a great sound writing for that ensemble. It was just always one of the highlights of my career because it was such a cool ensemble to write for. And the other project, also written by Ed, is Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow.
I know that one. Oh yeah.
And that was, the movie itself didn't do so well, but we went into it with the brief that we were supposed to write basically a big John Williams score, and Ed he just outdid himself writing this incredible, fantastic music. And of course, then he gave it what he wrote to me, and I had this huge, John Williams symphonic palette to work from, and it was, we just came up with this fantastic, some just really great sounding music. It was such a pleasure to, it was sort of to not have to worry about electronics and not have to worry about, oh, I don't like the piccolo, or I don't want the sound. It was like a good, old-fashioned, kick-ass,
And I'm sure the musicians loved it too, right?
The musicians, I think they really loved it too, yeah. And I just have to mention, the score that I think might have been the highlight for Elliot was either Batman Forever, which you mentioned, because it was so over the top. It was so crazy. And we had a gigantic orchestra. It was wonderful. But the other film I did with him that was really satisfying was Interview with a Vampire.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I think that is just one of his best scores. And he had, he was replacing a George Fenton score at the last minute. So he only had a couple of months to write it. And maybe it was the heat of the moment or something, but it was just a special experience putting that score together.
So, concluding, what would you? Thinking of all the great things that you told me now, what have you gained most from your career so far? What would you say? What have you gained most from your career?
What have I gained most? Well, I guess what I've gained the most is the ability to subsidize my theater work,
Okay.
because theater doesn't pay anything.
Is it really that kind of? Is it really that cliche?
It really is true. I mean, all those actors who go to Hollywood and then stay in Hollywood and giving up a theater career do it because the pay is, you just can't compare it. It's just crazy. Um, but I think one thing I've gained, but more seriously, I would say what I've gained from film. I don't know. I guess just an ability to be a part of creating so many kind of iconic things. You know, like The Lion King is probably the
Yes, I forgot to
best.
mention it. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, The Lion King is it's become, you know, its own thing. It's just so many people have seen it. It's the highest grossing single work ever. You know, it's just amazing. And to have been so closely, it's kind of a privilege to have been so, I guess, to have parts of that piece just reflect my creative input. But I am, you know, really proud of what that musical has become. And so it's really great. I think one of the most pleasurable things is for people, for me to say, well, I worked on, you know, a Fast and Furious movie, or I worked on Lion King, or I worked on, um, I don't know. I know one movie that was that was really exciting to a lot of people was Across the Universe.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the Beatles movie.
Yeah.
You know, and just being a part of these projects that people love. You know, the first Pirates of the Caribbean is another one
Oh, you've
that
been on
was,
that one too.
yeah, I worked on that, and it's just so great to have people to see that, you know, these things that I work on are making so many people, you know, happy, I guess, or it's something to,
Interesting feeling, right? Being part of pop culture, actually.
yeah, it's true. It kind of is. It's being a big part of pop culture, and also coming up, you know, coming up from a classical background, you know, you're sort of trained to sort of ignore pop culture, at least back then. Now it's become much more. There's been much more of people crossing over. Um, but yeah, to be able to say that I helped to create something as sort of well known and popular as The Lion King is, you know, I kind of feel like I've contributed something to the world, you know.